She was just a girl on the sidewalk, sketching chessboards in a worn notebook no one bothered to notice. Commuters passed without a glance until one man stopped. He was a polished businessman with a schedule to keep and a quiet confidence that this game would be his quickest win of the day. But when her final move landed, the crowd fell silent, and his world tilted in a way he couldn't explain. What started as a chance match between two strangers would become a battle of wits, trust, and redemption that neither of them saw coming. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The wind carried the late afternoon chill down the narrow streets, threading its way through the steady flow of commuters leaving their offices. The sun was dipping low, washing the city in long, angled shadows. Cars crawled along the avenue, their brake lights blinking like an impatient heartbeat. In the small park that sat wedged between two aging brick buildings, the sound of conversation mingled with the soft, deliberate clack of chess pieces striking the board. The park was known for its regulars, old men in wool caps who guarded their favorite benches, middle-aged hustlers who played blitz games for pocket change, and the occasional office worker who stopped by to watch a match before heading home. Ava sat at the edge of it all, her knees pulled close, the frayed straps of a canvas backpack resting limply at her side. Her hoodie was worn thin, the cuffs stretched from years of use, but she didn't seem to notice the cold. In her lap was a spiral-bound notebook with dog-eared corners, the paper smudged with faint pencil marks. Each page held neat little grids, 8 by 8 squares, some blank, some filled with tiny chess pieces drawn in precise positions. Her head was bent low, dark hair falling forward as she studied one of her sketches. Every so often she'd glance up toward the nearest game, watching the players' hands move over the board, their brows furrowed in silent calculation. Across the park, a man had paused on the path. His charcoal gray overcoat hung perfectly over a tailored navy suit, and the shoes on his feet looked as if they had never met a puddle. Ethan Cross was the kind of man people noticed sharp lines in his face, an expression that gave away nothing, eyes that moved with a quiet, calculating confidence. He had been cutting through the park on his way to a dinner meeting, but the sight of the chessboards had slowed his steps. He spotted Ava almost immediately. She was younger than anyone else there, maybe 16, maybe 17. But the way her eyes tracked the pieces was deliberate, focused. She wasn't just watching, she was following every move, running the game in her head. He lingered for a moment, curious, before stepping closer. The table nearest to her had just seen a game end. The victor, a heavy-set man in a flat cap, was collecting his winnings from the small crowd. Ethan slid into the now empty seat across from Ava, his voice even, "Do you play?" She glanced at him once, just long enough to take him in, then looked back at her notebook. "Sometimes." "Good," he said, already setting up the pieces. "Let's play a round." Ava didn't move at first. She turned a page in her notebook as if the invitation didn't interest her. But when he finished arranging the board, she closed the notebook and set it beside her. "White or black?" she asked. "You choose," he replied. "White." She reached for the king's pawn and slid it forward to squares. Ethan mirrored her move. Her next was the knight, smooth and sure. He noted the confidence in her movements, the lack of hesitation. 2 minutes in, his casual approach began to fade. She was reading the board faster than he expected, responding to every threat with a quiet efficiency that left him with fewer and fewer options. Around them, a couple of the regulars began to drift closer, sensing something worth watching. Ava's gaze never shifted from the pieces. She moved as if the game were already decided, her hands calm, her breathing steady. Ethan leaned back, slightly after one of her moves, reassessing. It wasn't often he had to fight to keep up, but she was forcing him to think. The next exchange came quickly, bishop for knight, pawn for pawn, and then he saw it, the trap he hadn't noticed before. 2 more moves, and his king was boxed in, his queen pinned uselessly to one side. Ava lifted her rook and set it down with a quiet finality. Checkmate. Ethan stared at the board for a moment longer than he should have, his mind replaying. the sequence, looking for the moment he lost control. She leaned back, folding her arms. "Good game," she said softly, though there was no trace of triumph in her voice. He smiled, polite but faint, pushing a 20 across the table toward her for the game. She shook her head, sliding the bill back. "I don't take money for this." He studied her for a beat. The streetlight above flickering on as the day surrendered to evening. She had already turned back to her notebook, flipping to a blank page, as if he had already been forgotten. Ethan rose from his seat, but as he walked away, the image of her calm, relentless game followed him, an unfinished puzzle he couldn't quite put down. The pieces were already in motion before Ethan truly considered what he was doing. His hand moved out of habit, sliding his knight into an early position, the kind of opening he used to play against his friends at the private club downtown. He wasn't here for a challenge, at least. That's what he told himself. He'd played enough casual games to know when someone was just killing time, and to him, Ava looked like a girl who passed her afternoons sketching boards she didn't know how to master. She responded immediately, her pawn advancing without hesitation. There was no trace of uncertainty in her movements, no fumbling or double-checking the rules. It was clean, deliberate. Ethan didn't think much of it at first. He'd seen players mimic confidence before, holding themselves like they had a plan when they were only reacting to whatever move came next. Still, the speed of her replies gave him pause. The sounds of the park pressed in from the edges, the shuffle of feet on cracked pavement, the murmur of conversation, the faint hiss of a bus braking at the corner. But at the table, there was only the rhythm of the game. Click of a piece on. Would pause? Click again? Ava's eyes never left the board, scanning the grid with a steady calm that began to feel practiced. Ethan leaned back after his fourth move, watching her from under his lashes. She wasn't playing safe. She was pressing forward, claiming space on the board with small, precise steps. Pawn here, a knight there, each piece positioned with purpose. He'd seen amateurs rush in without thinking, leaving gaps wide enough for an opponent to drive a truck through. She left no such openings. He decided to test her. Sliding his bishop along the diagonal, he set up a subtle trap, one designed to bait her into overcommitting. She didn't take it. Instead, she moved a rook into place, not blocking him outright, but shifting the flow of the game so his attack no longer mattered. He didn't like that. A couple of the old regulars had begun to wander closer, drawn in by the soft staccato of the match. One man in a tweed coat folded his arms and leaned against a nearby lamppost, watching with quiet interest. Another, carrying a paper cup of coffee, hovered just behind Ava's shoulder, his gaze flicking between the players. Ethan's next move came slower. He'd been expecting to cruise through this game with little effort, but now he found himself recalculating. She was pushing him into positions he didn't like, forcing him to guard instead of attack. He shifted in his seat, his polished shoe tapping once against the pavement before he stilled it. Ava didn't glance up once. Her focus was absolute, her gaze locked on the board as though nothing else existed. Every so often, her lips moved slightly as if reciting something only she could hear. When she reached forward to move a piece, it was always in one smooth, unbroken motion. He tried again to provoke her, sacrificing a pawn to lure her queen into a vulnerable spot. She ignored it entirely, choosing instead to develop her position along the opposite flank. The move was so unexpected that he stared at the board for a beat, wondering if he'd missed something. Then it dawned on him. She wasn't reacting to him. She was playing her own game, one he hadn't yet figured out. The murmurs from the small crowd grew just a little louder. Someone muttered, "She's got him," and Ethan felt a faint prickle along the back of his neck. He told himself it was nonsense. He'd played against grandmasters. He'd studied openings and defenses until they were second nature. He wasn't about to be outmaneuvered by a girl who'd walked into this match with a backpack and a pencil. Still, his hand hesitated above the pieces now. He was thinking more than he wanted to, calculating moves to 3 turns ahead, and finding fewer paths that gave him the upper hand. Across from him, Ava sat motionless, waiting. There was no smirk, no sign of satisfaction. Just the steady, unbroken stare of someone who saw the board more clearly than he did in that moment. Somewhere deep in his chest, Something shifted, the quiet stir of his competitive edge waking up.
Ow.
This was no longer a casual match. He was playing to win now. And for the first time since sitting down, Ethan Cross wasn't entirely sure that he would. The match had shifted into something taut and electric, though no one had said a word about it. The park's usual hum of noise seemed to fade around the table, replaced by the sharp punctuation of each move. Pieces clicked against the wooden squares with a kind of inevitability, as if the board itself were pulling the game toward its conclusion. Ava's face was unchanged, her eyes fixed on the grid as though the rest of the world didn't exist. Ethan sat straighter now, every inch of his posture sharpened by the growing awareness that he was in trouble. He studied the position. In front of him, the black and white army arrayed across the battlefield. On paper, it looked even. Material was balanced, nothing too lopsided. But the balance was a lie. The flow of the game was all hers. He could feel it. Every move he made seemed to funnel him into narrower corridors, closing his options one by one. He told himself it was just a temporary squeeze, that one well-placed exchange could open the board again. He believed it for exactly 2 moves. Ava's knight leaped forward, a neat arc that landed deep in his territory. He frowned, shifting in his seat, fingers hovering over a pawn before pulling back. Capturing the knight would leave his rook exposed. Ignoring it would leave a hole in his defense. He settled on a third option, sliding his bishop into a more active square, trying to reassert pressure. She didn't even pause. Her hand moved quickly, almost lazily, repositioning her rook with a speed that made him uneasy. It wasn't reckless. Could see now that every piece she had was working together, part of a structure he hadn't recognized until it was too late. His defenses were paper-thin against it. The murmurs from the small crowd grew louder. Someone whispered, "She's got him boxed," and another chuckled softly, a sound that prickled at the edge of his focus. He refused to look up. Next move was slower still. He repositioned his queen, feinting an attack on her exposed pawn. It was a bluff, one meant to buy him time and make her second-guess her momentum. But Ava didn't take the bait. Her eyes remained locked on the board, unhurried, patient in a way that unnerved him. She slid her queen forward, and suddenly the air felt heavier. It was then he saw it, the net tightening around his king. The pawn he'd dismissed earlier was now guarding a critical square. The rook he'd thought was too far from the action was cutting off his only escape file. And her queen was poised to deliver the final blow if he made a single misstep. He fought for air in the position, tried to find some hidden resource, but every calculation led back to the same conclusion. There was no out. 2 more moves, and she would have him. 1 more if he blundered. She moved her rook again, the piece gliding into perfect alignment with her queen. The trap was complete, though she didn't announce it yet. Ethan took one last deliberate look at the board, fingers brushing over the top of his king, as if testing the weight of surrender. He moved a pawn instead, a token gesture that changed nothing. Ava's hand reached forward, steady and sure, placing her queen in the final square. Her voice was soft, almost absent of triumph. "Checkmate." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling through the crowd. A few quiet gasps, a low whistle from someone standing behind him. Ethan leaned back, forcing a smile that felt thin on his face. "Well played," he said, his tone as even as he could make it. Ava only gave a small nod before leaning back, already reaching for her notebook. She opened it to a fresh page, her pencil scratching in quick lines as if recording something important before it faded from memory. Ethan's gaze lingered on her longer than he intended. He was unsettled. Not by the loss itself, he'd lost games before, but by the ease of it. She hadn't just beaten him, she had dismantled him, move by move, without so much as breaking a sweat. As he rose from the table, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve, he realized he wasn't walking away from the game at all. It was following him, every move replaying in his mind, each one a question he didn't yet know how to answer. And at the center of it was her, this quiet, homeless girl with a pencil and a notebook, who had just turned his certainty inside out. Ethan stood for a moment after the game ended, the weight of the murmuring crowd still pressing in from the edges. The cold had deepened with the fading light, a pale haze settling over the park as street lamps began to flicker on one by one. He reached into the inside pocket of his overcoat, pulled out a crisp bill, and slid it across the table toward her. "For the game?" he said lightly, as if it were a casual courtesy. The sort of gesture one made to an entertainer who'd offered a brief diversion on the way home. Iva didn't even glance at the money. She picked up her notebook and pencil, tucking them under her arm as she rose from her seat. "I don't take money for this," she replied, her voice even but firm, as if she'd had to say it more than once before. The words landed sharper than he expected, stripping the offer of any pretense. She didn't thank him for it, didn't soften the refusal with a smile. She turned away without waiting for his response, weaving through the small crowd that was already dispersing now that the spectacle had ended. Ethan watched her head toward the far side of the park, where an empty bench sat under a flickering lamp. She dropped her backpack onto the seat beside her, sank down, and pulled the notebook back into her lap. Within seconds, she was hunched over the page again, the faint scratch of her pencil barely audible over the rustle of leaves. It was as if their game hadn't happened at all. She didn't look after him, didn't seem to care whether he stayed or left. That unsettled him more than the loss itself. People noticed him. They remembered him. It was part of the currency he moved through the world with. But she had stepped into his orbit, humiliated him on a chessboard in front of strangers, and then drifted right back out as if he were just another face in the park. He lingered for a moment, his hands in his pockets, pretending to watch another game a few tables away. But his eyes kept drifting back to her head bent, hair falling forward. The steady movement of her hand as she sketched another position. She was somewhere else entirely, her focus turned inward in a way he couldn't quite read. That concentration, the same unblinking attention she had given to their match, held a kind of gravity. He knew it wasn't just habit, it was discipline. The kind that didn't come from casual practice. A gust of wind rattled the branches above, scattering a few yellow leaves across the path. He adjusted his scarf and told himself he had better things to do than stand here thinking about a street game he'd lost. His dinner meeting was still on the other side of town, and he didn't have the luxury of being late. Yet when he finally turned to go, the park seemed quieter than it had before, as if he were stepping out of some closed-off space he hadn't realized he'd entered. He took the long way out, letting the gravel path wind him toward the exit gate. But each step felt reluctant, his mind snagged on details he didn't want to admit mattered. The way her fingers had moved over the board without hesitation, the quick glance she'd given him before every decisive move, the refusal to take his money, not out of pride exactly, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knew her value wasn't measured in cash, slipped across a table. By the time he reached the street, the noise of the city rushed back in horns. Tires hissing over wet pavement, the sharp voices of pedestrians talking into phones. He merged into the flow of people heading toward the subway, but the image of her at that bench wouldn't leave him. He could still see the curve of her shoulder under the thin hoodie, the smudge of graphite on her knuckle, the way the world seemed to dissolve when she was locked into her own thoughts. It wasn't just that she'd beaten him, it was how she'd done it without fanfare, without gloating, without even giving the impression that winning mattered. For her, the game had been part of something else, something he didn't yet understand. And that was what made it impossible to let go. The city outside Ethan's apartment windows was still restless, neon spilling across wet pavement as the last of the evening's rain lingered in shallow puddles. His high-rise had the kind of glass that muted the noise below, but even in the silence, he felt a hum of energy he couldn't shake. The meeting he'd been heading to earlier had gone well enough. Numbers discussed, contracts promised, but none of it had settled in his mind. His thoughts kept circling back to a worn notebook, a quiet girl in a threadbare hoodie, and a game that had ended with his king cornered like a trapped animal. He poured himself a drink he didn't touch and sat down at his desk, the glow from his laptop lighting the room in a cool, sterile blue. He opened a chess database he hadn't logged into in months, the kind used by serious players and analysts. Rows of famous games filled the screen. Grandmasters, world champions, decades of theory, and he began typing in the moves from memory. The sequence was still vivid, each step etched into his mind by the sharp surprise of realizing too late what she was building The program populated a list of games with similar openings, but none of them followed her exact path. He leaned closer, scrolling through variations, branching lines that twisted and collapsed into dead ends. Her moves were orthodox at first, almost textbook, but somewhere in the middle she'd shifted, slipping into a pattern the database didn't seem to recognize. That alone made him pause. He tried again, adjusting for possible differences, feeding in alternative move orders in case he'd remembered something wrong. But every time he reached the middle game, the trail went cold. No matches. No famous precedents. It's just a string of choices that didn't look extraordinary until the net began to close and you realized there was no way out. He sat back, the leather chair creaking softly beneath him, eyes fixed on the empty search result. In business, he prided himself on recognizing patterns, market shifts, negotiation tactics, the subtle signs of when someone was bluffing and when they were holding a winning hand. Patterns meant predictability, and predictability meant control. This girl's game had been all wrong in the sense that it hadn't followed the expected path, and yet it had been flawless. He closed the database and pulled up a different site, one where players from around the world uploaded their own games. Amateur matches, local tournaments, even street games recorded on phones. It was a messier archive, but sometimes more revealing. He searched there too. Hours passed unnoticed as he clicked through recordings, diagrams, commentary threads filled with the jargon of enthusiasts. Still nothing. It should have been a small thing, an oddity he could dismiss and forget by morning. But the more he failed to find her strategy, the more it nagged at him. People didn't invent perfect traps out of thin air, not without study, not without practice. And someone living out of a backpack in a city park shouldn't have had the resources for the kind of training her precision suggested. He thought about the way she'd moved her pieces, each one part of some invisible architecture he hadn't seen until it was too late. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a fluke. She had built that ending from the very first move, and he'd walked right into it. The drink sat untouched on his desk, the ice long since melted. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling a strange mix of irritation and curiosity knotting in his chest. She'd refused his money, brushed him off, and gone back to her notebook. Without a flicker of interest in who he wasn't used to that either. By the time he closed his laptop, the city had quieted, the streets below nearly empty. But the silence didn't bring him peace. The image of her bent over the board, eyes steady, movements sure, kept replaying behind his eyes. It wasn't just that she had beaten him, it was that he didn't understand how. And for a man like Ethan Cross, not understanding was something he couldn't leave alone. The next afternoon, the park carried the same mix of movement and stillness. It always did, buses groaning as they pulled away from the curb, the metallic rattle of a food cart somewhere near the corner, and the faint, rhythmic clack of chess pieces being set down on boards. The sky was a pale gray, holding that indecisive light that made it hard to tell if it would rain or clear by evening. Ethan's shoes clicked against the uneven stone path as he made his way back toward the tables.
Ow.
His hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. He told himself it was just curiosity, the same kind that drew him to any puzzle he hadn't solved. He wanted to see the opening she'd played again, to test if it had been a trick or if she could repeat it. But there was something else under that reasoning, something less defined, an itch that had been there since the moment she turned her back on him without a second thought. A few of the regulars were in their usual places. He recognized the man in the tweed coat hunched over a board against an opponent in a battered leather jacket. 2 tables down, a cluster of teenagers were playing blitz, the timer clicking furiously as they slammed pieces into place. And there, in the far corner, under the same flickering lamppost as before, sat Ava. Her backpack was slouched beside her on the bench, her knees drawn up as she balanced the familiar notebook on her legs. She didn't look up when he approached. Ethan stopped in front of her bench, waiting for her to acknowledge him. She didn't. Her pencil kept moving, the faint sound of graphite against paper lost under the noises of the park. "Afternoon," he said finally. She didn't respond. He glanced at the Pagemore chess diagrams, each grid marked with little notations. "Busy?" he tried. That earned him a glance, though it was brief and flat. Something like that. He gestured toward an empty table nearby. How about another game? Her pencil paused for half a second before resuming. Why? Call it a rematch, he said. Or maybe just a chance for me to embarrass myself again. Your choice. That drew a faint smirk, though she didn't. Lift her eyes from the notebook. You're not used to losing, are you? Not like that, he admitted. She kept writing, as if weighing something that had nothing to do with him. He waited, giving her the space to decide. The park around them seemed to slow in that moment, the sounds of passing cars and shifting feet fading into the background. Finally, she closed the notebook and slid it into her backpack. One game, she said, standing. Then I go back to what I was doing. Ethan nodded, leading the way to the table. She sat opposite him. Her movements as economical as the day before, no wasted gestures. She reached for the white pieces again, without asking, arranging them quickly. While he mirrored her with black, as the first pieces were set into motion, he realized she was already watching him, not his face, but his hands, his rhythm, the way he hesitated before committing to a square. Eyes didn't dart around the board. They moved slowly, absorbing the whole position in one sweep. The first few moves came quickly, almost identical to the start of their last game. Ethan felt the tension coil in him early. The knowledge that she could see patterns he didn't. But this time, he promised himself he would keep the reins. Somewhere behind him, a man's voice called out a greeting to another player, and the smell of roasted peanuts drifted over from the corner vendor. Ava didn't seem to notice any of it. When she slid her knight into a central square, the move so smooth it almost went unnoticed. Ethan felt that same hum from yesterday's ascents, that the game was shifting already and that she was the one setting the terms. For now, she said nothing, and he didn't push for conversation. The board was speaking for both of them, and it was saying exactly what he'd come here to hear. This was no fluke. Whatever she had, she could do it again. And now he wanted, more than ever, to understand how. From the moment the first pawn moved, Ethan could sense the difference. Ava's play was sharper than the day before, her moves arriving without the smallest hesitation. She was setting a pace he didn't entirely like, fast enough to force him into quick decisions, slow enough to keep control. The early exchanges passed in a blur, his knight for her bishop, a pawn trade that seemed harmless, until he realized she'd gained more space in the center. Each piece she moved carried weight, building toward something he couldn't yet see, but could feel closing. He tried to counter with aggression, pushing his queen into play earlier than usual, hoping to catch her off guard. She didn't flinch. Her rook slid across the board with quiet precision, cutting off his attack before it could develop. From there, the positions shifted in her favor, small advantages stacking one over the other like stones. Within 10 moves, he was defending again. Within 15, he was fighting to keep his king from being hemmed in on 3 sides. She didn't give him the luxury of slow, deliberate thought. Every time he paused too long, she drummed her fingers lightly on the table knot, impatient. Just present, letting him know she was waiting. The sound was maddening in its calm. The crowd that had started to gather again seemed to sense the inevitability of it. A man in a faded sports cap leaned in to watch, whispering something to his friend that earned a short laugh. Ethan ignored them, his focus narrowing to the board and the young woman across from him. He tried to block the next sequence he suspected. She was building, but her reply dismantled his defense in a single move. When it happened fast. Her bishop cut a diagonal lane across the board, trapping his rook. He responded by shuffling his king to safety, or what he thought was safety only for her queen to slide into place with ruthless efficiency. The checkmate landed with such inevitability that it almost felt rehearsed. He exhaled slowly, forcing his jaw to unclench, and leaned back in his chair. Twice, he said, half to himself. Ava gave a small shrug, as if the outcome had been obvious from the start. She reached forward and reset the pieces without looking at him, the soft clink of wood on wood filling the space between them. Ethan leaned forward, forearms resting on the table. Where'd you learn to play like that? She glanced up briefly, her expression unreadable. Here and there. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. Her tone was mild but final, the kind of voice that knew how to close a door without slamming it. He studied her for a moment, noting the way she kept her attention on the board, as if arranging the pieces mattered more than the conversation. "You've been playing long? A while? With who?" Her hands paused for just a fraction of a second, but she didn't look up. "Does it matter?" "It does to me." She met his gaze then, her eyes clear and steady. "Not everything's about you." The words were delivered without heat, without cruelty, but they landed just the same. He sat back, feeling the sting of it even as his curiosity deepened. There was something there, something about the way she carried herself. The guardedness in her answers, the refusal to be impressed by him. Most people in his world tried to impress him without even realizing it. Ava seemed determined not to. When she finished resetting the pieces, she stood, tucking her notebook under her arm. "That's enough for today." Ethan opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. She was already turning away, heading back toward her usual bench under the lamppost. He watched her go, the edge of frustration still sharp in his chest. But layered under it, stubborn and insistent, was something else, an interest he couldn't reason away. Didn't like losing, but losing to her made him want to know everything she wasn't telling him. The next day, Ethan didn't bring a bill folded neatly in his pocket. He didn't come with the intention of slipping a tip across the table or coaxing her into another match she would almost certainly win. Instead, he arrived with something else in mind. The air was warmer than it had been all week, though the clouds still hung, low and heavy. The park was busy, office workers cutting through on their way to lunch. The regular chess players already bent over their boards, the sound of conversation drifting above the occasional clatter of a falling piece. Ava was where he expected her to be, settled on the same bench with her knees drawn up, notebook balanced on her lap. He stopped a few feet away. "Play again?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Not hungry for wins today." "Then maybe you're just hungry," he said, tilting his head toward the street where the red and white striped awning of a food truck stood out among the parked cars. The smell of grilled onions and fresh bread carried on the wind. Her pencil paused. She glanced at him, skeptical. "What's this? Your new tactic? Feed your opponent so they go easy on you." "Call it a peace offering," he said. "No strings." She hesitated, just long enough for him to think she'd refuse. Then she slid her notebook into her backpack and stood. "Fine, but I pick what I want. Deal." They walked in silence to the truck, joining a short line of customers. The man inside wore a white paper hat and moved with the efficiency of someone who'd been making sandwiches in the same cramped space for 20 years. Ava ordered a cheesesteak and a bottle of water. Ethan asked for the same. When their food came, they took it to a small metal table near the curb, the kind with peeling green paint and a wobble in one leg. Ava unwrapped her sandwich and took a bite so big, he wondered if she'd eaten yet that day. She chewed slowly, eyes on the street, as if she were still deciding whether to talk to him at all. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You? Going to tell me where you learned to play like that?" She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Why do you care so much?" "'Cause I like knowing how things work." "And you," he gestured vaguely toward her, "don't fit the usual explanation." She considered that for a moment, then shrugged. "My dad taught me. We used to play every night after dinner. He was the kind of person who never let you win just to make you feel better. If you lost, you learned why." Ethan nodded. "He sounds like a good teacher." He was. Her voice softened slightly, but then she took another bite and didn't elaborate. "And now?" he asked. "You still play with anyone else?" Her eyes flicked to his, then away. "Not really. Not since he died." Something in her tone made him pause. "How long ago was that?" "When I was 14. She spoke like it was a fact in a textbook, stripped of weight, but the flatness carried its own kind of heaviness. "After that, it was just me. Shelters mostly, sometimes sleeping on couches if I knew someone I could trust for a while." She set her sandwich down, her fingers resting lightly on the wax paper. Chess was easier than people. The rules made sense. Ethan didn't interrupt. She'd already said more than she had in the last 2 days combined, and he could tell she wasn't someone who shared lightly. "I read whatever books I could get from the library," she went on, "copied games into my notebook, studied them until I could see the patterns without looking. Then I'd come here to practice against whoever would play me. Guess they stopped playing you, he said. Some did, she admitted, a faint smile touching her lips. Others just bet they could win. I didn't mind. Kept me in. Meals. He studied her across the small table. She was matter-of-fact about it all. No trace of self-pity, no attempt to dress it up. It struck him that she wasn't trying to make an impression. She was just telling him the truth, as if it didn't matter what he thought of it. When they finished eating, she crumpled the sandwich wrapper into a tight ball and tossed it into the trash can beside the truck. Thanks for the food, she said. It's any time, he replied, and he meant it. She slung her backpack over one shoulder and started back toward the park without waiting for him, but he followed anyway. That brief conversation had given him just enough to know that her story was more than a curiosity, was a map he hadn't yet learned how to read. And he wasn't done asking questions. Ethan had always been deliberate about how he spent his time, but over the next week he found himself making detours through the park more often than he cared to admit. Sometimes he told himself it was just on the way to a meeting. There were times he didn't bother with excuses. He would cut across the square in the late afternoon, the air thick with the scent of roasted peanuts and exhaust, and drift toward the cluster of tables where the regulars gathered. Ava was almost always there. She wasn't on her bench with her notebook. She was already seated across from someone. The pieces set, her hood pulled up against the wind. She played with the same quiet focus she had against him, but now, with the pressure off his own game, Ethan could watch without being pulled into the current. The more he watched, the more he realized she wasn't showing everyone what she'd shown him. Against some opponents, she was merciless, tight, efficient, never offering a single misstep. They would leave the table muttering under their breath, shaking their heads. But then there were the others. He noticed it first with a man in a red scarf, a familiar face around the park. They played quickly, exchanging pieces in a way that seemed careless. She missed an obvious tactic, one that would have put her in a winning position. And instead, she moved a pawn into a slow, useless advance. A few minutes later, the man claimed victory with a grin, and she congratulated him without a hint of sarcasm. It happened again the next day. Different player, same pattern. An early advantage left unclaimed. A sudden blunder that didn't look like an accident to someone who'd studied enough games to know better. Ethan leaned against a lamppost, arms crossed, watching as she packed up her pieces after the loss. The man across from her looked pleased, almost smugged, and she didn't seem to mind in the slightest. It took a few more games for him to be sure, but by the end of the week, there was no question. Ava let certain people win. Not everyone's just the ones who came back often, the ones who probably had their own pride tied to the board. She gave them just enough of a fight to feel they'd earned it, but never so much that they'd walk away humiliated. He started timing her matches, noting how long they lasted. The real games when she played to win were over in minutes. The others stretched, meandering toward an inevitable conclusion she could have avoided. And each time she lost, she left the board with that same easy calm, slipping into the background as if nothing had happened. Ethan couldn't decide if it was strategy or something else. In business, you learn to temper your wins, make them too decisive, and you made enemies. Maybe Ava understood that instinctively, or maybe it was just survival. The park wasn't a tournament hall. It was a place where people came to pass the time, where egos were fragile, and where being too good might draw the wrong kind of attention. One afternoon, he watched her dismantle a young guy in a black hoodie, taking his queen before he'd even developed his bishops. She didn't hold back at all, and the game ended fast. A few minutes later, an older man sat down across from her. She played him like a different person, softer, her attacks folding before they could do damage. He walked away beaming, and she just tucked her notebook under her arm and moved on. When she caught him watching that time, she didn't say anything. She just raised an eyebrow as if to ask what he thought he was seeing. He didn't answer, not out loud. But in his head, the question was already there, building into something that would eventually demand a conversation. Why hide what you can do? And more importantly, what would happen if she stopped? Ethan waited until a Thursday afternoon to set his plan in motion. The park was busier that day, the benches filled with people lingering over lunch breaks, and the chess tables already occupied. by the regulars. He'd called in a favor to make this happen. An old acquaintance from the city chess club, a man named Lucas Grant, who had the kind of resume that drew murmurs in competitive circles. Lucas was the club's reigning champion, a fixture in weekend tournaments. The kind of player who'd spent years refining openings and middle game tactics until they were second nature. When Lucas arrived, dressed in a pressed shirt and carrying his own set of tournament pieces in a leather case, Ethan greeted him with a nod. "There's someone I want you to meet," he said, leading him toward the far side of the park. Ava was already there, seated at her usual table under the lamppost. Sketching in her notebook, she looked up briefly as they approached. "This is Lucas," Ethan said. "You up for a game?" "Ah!" Ava's gaze flicked to the leather case in Lucas's hand. "You carry your own set?" "Just a habit," Lucas replied with a friendly smile. "Old superstition? You mind if we use it?" She shrugged. "Doesn't matter to me." They set up the board, Lucas taking black, Ava white. Ethan leaned against a nearby bench, close enough to watch, but far enough that neither player felt crowded. He didn't tell her who Lucas was, and she didn't ask. She opened with the same calm, steady moves he'd come to recognize: pawn 2e4, knight 2f3. Lucas mirrored her pace at first, testing her responses with small probes, nothing too aggressive. 5 moves in, Ethan saw the subtle shift in Lucas's expression. It was the look of someone who realized the game in front of him wasn't going to be casual. Ava was already shaping the board to her advantage, her pieces moving with a quiet inevitability that didn't leave much room for counterplay. Lucas adjusted, leaning forward, his brow furrowing slightly as he began to dig in. Few of the regulars had noticed. 2 men from the next table stood and drifted over, hands in their pockets, pretending not to stare too obviously. The food truck vendor paused mid-order to glance over. It wasn't often the park hosted a game worth watching, and there was something in the air now, an unspoken agreement that this one might be different. Lucas tried an early pawn break on the queen's side, testing her reaction. She responded by shifting her rook into a position that cut off his advance entirely. When he adjusted to build an attack on the other flank, she was already there, her bishop locking down the diagonal before he could gain ground. It was the same pattern Ethan had seen before: small, incremental moves that closed off possibilities, until the opponent found themselves boxed in. By the 12th move, Lucas was leaning on one elbow, staring at the board as though willing it to reveal something he'd missed. Ava just waited, her expression unreadable. She didn't rush him, didn't fidget, didn't break eye contact with the pieces. When he finally moved, she answered in less than 3 seconds, her queen sliding into a position that left him visibly unsettled. The murmurs from the small crowd grew louder. Someone whispered, "She's got him," and Ethan caught the flicker of irritation in Lucas's jaw. The end came soon after. Ava forced an exchange that left her with a rook and bishop against his lone rook, and from there, it was only a matter of technique. She tightened the net with deliberate precision, every move pressing him toward the inevitable. When the checkmate landed, it was quiet, almost anticlimactic. Ava leaned back slightly, nodding once. "Good game," she said. Lucas exhaled through his nose, then gave a small, rueful smile. "Yeah, good game." He began packing up his pieces, glancing once at Ethan with a look that said, "Without words, you could have warned me." As the crowd dispersed, Ava gathered her notebook and stood. "Friend of yours?" she asked. Ethan's mouth curved into something between a smile and a smirk, something like that. She didn't press. She just slung her backpack over her shoulder and walked toward her usual bench, leaving Ethan standing there with the quiet satisfaction of knowing his theory had been proven. She didn't just win when she wanted to, she could win against anyone, and now more people than just him knew it. It was a Saturday, and the park was more crowded than usual. The air carried the sharp edge of early autumn, crisp enough that most people kept their hands wrapped around coffee cups. A group had gathered near the center tables, where Ava had just finished a game against a tall man with a shaved head and an overconfident grin. She'd won in under 10 minutes, her victory as quiet and unceremonious as always. But this opponent didn't take it the way most did. "Guess you just got lucky," he said loudly, leaning back in his chair so his voice carried to the people watching. You'll probably play the same game every time and hope no one notices. Ava began resetting the pieces without looking up. Or maybe you just weren't paying attention. The man smirked, ignoring the hint to let it go. Make you think you're something special because you can beat guys in the park. I've played in real tournaments. This, he gestured at the board. This is child's play. A few in the crowd chuckled uncomfortably. Ethan, who had been watching from a short distance, stepped closer. He'd seen plenty of egos bruised at this park, but there was something about the man's tone that made his jaw tighten. Sounds like you're saying you want a rematch? Ethan said evenly. The man turned to him, eyes narrowing. And you are? Just someone who knows how to lose without making excuses, Ethan replied. That got a few laughs from the onlookers, but the man didn't back down. She's not even that good, he said, raising his voice again. Half of you are just impressed because he stopped himself there, but the implication was obvious. Ava finally looked up. Her expression was calm, almost bored, but there was a sharpness in her gaze that hadn't been there before. You know what's funny? She said, her voice steady enough to cut through the low hum of the crowd. The ones who talk the loudest after losing are never the ones who learn from it. You've been playing for how long? Years? And you still don't recognize when someone's thinking more than 3 moves ahead of you. The man's smile faltered, but she didn't stop. You want to know why you lost? It's not because you didn't know the openings. It's because the moment you sat down, you assumed you'd win. You didn't read the board. You didn't adapt. You couldn't imagine someone you underestimated seeing through every single move you made. The space around the table had gone quiet. People leaned in, not wanting to miss a word. Ava didn't raise her voice, but the precision of her tone made each sentence land like a well-placed piece on the board. So here's the truth, she continued. You can play in all the real tournaments you want. You can memorize every famous game, rehearse every line, but until you stop thinking the person across from you is less capable than you are, you'll keep losing. To me. To anyone who's paying attention. The man stared at her, the flush in his face deepening. For a moment it seemed like he might fire back, but no words came. He pushed his chair back with a scrape and muttered something under his breath before disappearing into the thinning crowd. Ethan watched him go, then looked back at Ava. She was already arranging the pieces again, her face as unreadable as it had been before the exchange. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You didn't need me to step in. She glanced at him, a small, fleeting smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Didn't think I did. The next challenger stepped forward hesitantly, clearly aware of what had just happened. Ava gestured to the seat opposite her without a word. The crowd remained quieter now, but with a new energy, one that had nothing to do with the game they were about to watch, and everything to do with the fact that no one there would be underestimating her again. The crowd had thinned after the confrontation, leaving only the diehards, the old men who played until their hands stiffened in the cold. The younger regulars, who lingered on the edges waiting for a turn at the board. Ava had just finished another game, this one quiet and unremarkable, and was packing her pieces back into a worn cloth pouch. Ethan was still leaning against the lamppost a few feet away, watching her with that same unreadable expression he'd worn since the first day they'd met. When she stood, slinging her backpack over one shoulder, he stepped forward. You free for a minute? She gave him a wary glance. Why? I've got an idea, he said. One, you might actually. Like, she snorted softly. That's a bold assumption. On, he said, motioning toward a nearby bench. Humor me. Ava followed more out of curiosity than anything else, and sat at the far end of the bench, leaving a deliberate gap between them. She crossed her arms. All right, let's hear it. I run a company, he began, his tone straightforward. A fairly big one. My days are packed with meetings, negotiations, decisions that can't wait. I need someone who can keep up, someone who sees the angles that other people miss. She tilted her head. And you think that's me? No, it is, he said, without hesitation. I've seen the way you think. You read people the same way you read the board, quietly, precisely, without getting distracted by noise. That's rare. Her brow furrowed. This sounds like you're offering me a job. I am, he said. Assistant. strategic sounding. Bored. Call it whatever you want. Just until you're back on your feet. She shook her head, a humorless laugh escaping her. Right, because a street player from the park is exactly who a guy in a suit hires to run his schedule. I'm not interested in someone who fits a job description, he said. I'm interested in someone who can help me see what I'm not seeing, and you've already proven you can do that. Gaze narrowed, suspicion threading through. Her voice. Why? You don't even know me. I know enough, he replied evenly. I know you don't fold under pressure. I know you've learned to survive without asking for handouts. And I know you've beaten me twice without breaking. A sweat. That's more than I can say for most people in my office. She looked away, watching a pair of pigeons strut across the pavement near the trash can. Sounds like you're offering charity. It's not charity, he said firmly. I don't believe in charity. This is a trade you give me what? You see what you know, and I give you a paycheck and some stability. 1 week. If you hate it, you walk away. No strings. Silence settled between them for a moment. She picked at the edge of her sleeve, considering. The idea was absurd on its face. A girl who'd been living out of shelters and backpacks, working in the kind of glass building he no doubt occupied. But there was something in his voice, a quiet certainty that made it feel less like a trap, and more like a challenge. 1 week, she repeated slowly. 1 week, he confirmed. She studied him, searching for the catch. If there was one, he wasn't showing it. Finally, she sighed. Fine, but I'm not wearing one of those. Pencil skirts and heels. A faint smile tugged at his mouth. Wear whatever you want. She stood, adjusting the strap of her backpack. When do I start? Monday. I'll send a car. She gave him a look that suggested she wasn't sure if he was serious. You do that, and I might not get in it. Then I'll wait at the park myself, he said. And for the first time, she thought she caught a flicker of something almost like amusement in his expression. Ava shook her head and started toward the exit, not looking back. 1 week. That was all she was agreeing to. But as she walked, she felt the weight of the decision settling in. She had no idea what she was stepping into war, how much it was about to change. Monday morning came with the kind of cold that bit through fabric. It made every breath visible in the air. Ava stood on the sidewalk outside a building that looked like it belonged to another world entirely, 40 floors of steel and glass rising against the pale sky, its surface catching the weak sunlight like a blade. People streamed in through the revolving doors, all dressed in sharp lines and muted colors, their strides brisk, their conversations clipped. She tugged her hoodie tighter, the sleeves frayed at the cuffs, and took a step forward. Inside, the lobby was so polished it seemed to hum with its own kind of energy. The floor gleamed underfoot, the marble reflecting the overhead lights like a still pond. Behind a sleek reception desk, 2 women in matching charcoal suits glanced up, their practiced smiles freezing for a fraction of a second as they took in Ava's worn sneakers and faded jeans. Can I help you? One of them asked, her tone polite, but edged with that kind of professional distance Ava had heard before. Someone measuring her before deciding where she belonged. I'm here to see Ethan Cross, Ava said, adjusting. The strap of her backpack earned a quick exchange of glances between the 2 women before one reached for the phone. Mr. Cross's guest is here, she said, her voice shifting into a smoother, more deferential register. Moments later, a man in a tailored suit appeared from the bank of elevators, his expression unreadable as he approached. Ms. Ward? He asked. That's me. Follow me. They rode up in silence, the numbers climbing in steady increments, till the doors opened onto a floor where everything looked even more expensive. The air was cooler here, quieter, glass-walled offices. Lined the corridor, each one containing people hunched over glowing screens or speaking into headsets. Every movement seemed deliberate, efficient, as if no one here wasted so much as a breath. Ethan was waiting in his office, a vast space with floor-tizzling windows that framed the city like a moving painting. The desk was wide and uncluttered, the leather chairs arranged in perfect symmetry. He stood when she entered, gesturing toward one of them. Glad you came, he said. She sat, her eyes sweeping the room before settling on him. This place is a lot. You'll get used to it, he replied. Today's about observing. No one's expecting you to jump in yet. But Ava didn't just observe. She noticed. In the first meeting she sat through, she saw the way the senior staff deferred to Ethan not just because of his title, but because he moved the conversation like a player controlling the center of the board. She noticed how the department heads avoided eye contact, their disagreement disguised in polite phrases, but obvious in the stiffness of their posture. When someone tried to steer the discussion off track, Ethan redirected them with a single question that forced them back into his rhythm. By the second meeting, Ava was already mapping the room like she would a chess position. The assistant who hovered near the door, never speaking, but always noting who reacted to what. The finance manager who asked questions designed to stall. The marketing lead who aligned herself with Ethan's suggestions before he'd even finished speaking. Pieces. Every one of them moving according to rules they probably didn't even think about anymore. Between meetings, she trailed Ethan down the hall, catching snippets of conversations that all carried the same undercurrent calculation. Strategy, an unspoken game being played in the spaces between words. She wasn't intimidated by it. Anything it was familiar. The park had its own hierarchy too, unspoken and constantly shifting. The difference here was the suits, the stakes, and the fact that the board stretched far beyond what you could see in a single glance. By the end of the day, she'd spoken little, keeping her presence almost invisible. But she had filled pages. In her notebook with quick diagrams, not of chessboards this time, but of names, roles, and the subtle lines of influence that connected them. When Ethan caught sight of her notes as she closed the book, one corner of his mouth lifted, almost like he knew exactly what she was doing. "See anything useful?" he asked. She met his gaze without hesitation. "I see a game you've already been playing." "For a long time, I'm just learning the moves." His smile deepened just slightly. "Then you're already ahead of most." The city lights were beginning to glow by the time she left the building, her reflection in the glass doors a strange blend of out of place and exactly where she needed to be. It still felt like another world, but it was one she understood more than she'd expected. The conference room was colder than the rest of the office, its long glass table reflecting the overhead lights in a way that made the space feel even sharper, more deliberate. Ava sat a few seats down from Ethan, a legal pad in front of her, though she hadn't written a word. She was there to watch, as she had been for the past few days. But the energy in the room told her this meeting wasn't just another formality. The men across from Ethan were older, seasoned in the way of people who had been in more deals than they could count. Their suits were expensive, but not flashy, the kind of understated that said they were confident enough not to need attention. They were from a supplier Ethan's company had been dealing with for years. But Ava had already overheard enough in the hallways to know the relationship had grown tense. Rising costs, late deliveries, mutual suspicion. Today, both sides were here to either find a way forward or quietly cut ties. The opening moves were polite enough. Smiles, handshakes, thin pleasantries, but Ava recognized the tension beneath. When the discussion turned to numbers, the air shifted. The man in the center, clearly the one in charge on their side, leaned forward with a proposal that cut into Holt Dynamics margins far more than Ethan was going to accept. Ava saw it in his posture, the slight narrowing of his eyes, but he didn't react outwardly. Ethan countered with a figure that was fair, maybe even generous. But the other man shook his head before the sentence was finished. "We can't make that work," he said, his tone smooth but unyielding. For the next 20 minutes they circled each other in careful increments, offers, counter-offers, each one rejected just as quickly as it was made. Ava watched their movements the way she'd watch a chessboard. The supplier's lead negotiator was playing aggressively, pushing for concessions early, trying to force Ethan into defending instead of attacking. Ethan was holding his ground, but she could see the shape of the game forming, and it wasn't in his favor. She leaned toward him slightly, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear. "You're defending the whole board. Pick a file and take control." He didn't look at her, but she saw the faintest flicker of curiosity in his expression. "Explain." "Right now, you're reacting to every offer they throw out. It's like defending every piece at once. You're just treading water. Find the one thing they can't afford to lose, and build everything around that." force them to protect it. It was barely more than a whisper, but she could tell he was considering it. A few moments later, he shifted in his seat, straightened his papers, and steered the conversation away from the raw numbers entirely. Instead, he began pressing on delivery schedules, something the other side had brushed past earlier. "Let's be honest," Ethan said evenly. "Your current turnaround times are already straining the contract. If we can't guarantee delivery within 21 days, every other term we're discussing is irrelevant." The shift landed like a well-placed piece. The lead negotiator hesitated, glancing briefly at the man to his right before answering. It was small, but Ava saw it a tell. Delivery was their weakness. They couldn't risk losing the contract over it. Ethan pressed further, framing every remaining term around securing faster, more reliable delivery. He offered a price slightly lower than his earlier counter, but tied it to strict performance clauses. By the time the meeting wrapped, they had agreed to terms far closer to Ethan's starting point than the supplier had intended. As the other side gathered their documents, one of them muttered something about tough tables, and the lead negotiator offered a handshake with the kind of reluctant respect Ava had seen in defeated opponents at the park. When the room was empty again, Ethan turned toward her. "Positional play?" he asked. She shrugged lightly. "You can't win by chasing every move they make. You have to control the space that matters most. Make them play around you." Corner of his mouth lifted. "Not bad for your first week." She smiled faintly, leaning back in her chair. "Not bad for your first game." The remark earned her a brief, quiet laugh, but there was something else in his look and acknowledgement that her presence at the table wasn't just for observation anymore. She'd moved a piece, and it had mattered. It began subtly at first, almost as if Ethan was testing the waters. The next time they walked into a meeting together, instead of introducing Ava simply by name, he added, "This is Ava Ward, my strategic advisor." The words landed with more weight than she expected. Heads turned, pens stilled above notepads. A few polite nods followed, but she caught the brief flicker in people's eyes, the calculation. That always came when a new piece appeared on the board, and no one quite knew how it moved yet. For Ava, the title was unexpected. She had only been in the building for a short time. She was still getting used to its rhythms, the clipped pace of conversations in the hallway, the quiet hum of ambition that seemed to linger in the air. Yet the way Ethan said it left no room for doubt. It wasn't a temporary role, not in his mind. The first few meetings after that, she felt the shift immediately. People looked to her more often, sometimes to gauge her reaction to a proposal, sometimes with a kind of polite scrutiny, as if they were trying to figure out how she'd managed to land in that chair at all. She learned quickly to keep her expression neutral, to speak only when she had something worth saying. But when she did speak, pointing out a flaw in a projection, suggesting an alternative approach to a deal, she noticed Ethan listening closely, giving her the space to finish without interruption. That small but deliberate act made her voice feel steadier each time. Her confidence began to grow in ways she hadn't anticipated. She no longer sat at the edges of the table, content to observe. She leaned in, asked sharper questions, and started to anticipate what information Ethan would need before he asked for it. It was like being back at a chessboard, except now the pieces were people. The moves stretched across weeks instead of minutes. She began to map the personalities around her, the cautious ones, who always hedged their positions, the aggressive ones who tried to dominate the conversation, the quiet ones whose silence usually meant they were waiting for the right moment to tip the balance. But for every nod of approval she earned, there were other looks cooler, less welcoming. She could feel the undercurrent of curiosity in the office hallways. More than once, she caught two employees stopping their conversation. When she walked past, she overheard her name whispered in the break room, the words muffled, but the tone unmistakable. They wanted to know who she was, where she'd come from, and what exactly she'd done to earn Ethan Cross's trust. The jealousy was harder too. Ignore. A senior analyst who used to greet her with easy smiles now barely acknowledged her. A manager from marketing began questioning her suggestions in meetings, pressing for details in a way that felt less like genuine interest and more like a challenge. Even Nora, who had been polite if distant, seemed to watch her more closely, her expression unreadable. Ava wasn't surprised. In the park, winning too many games in a row had always drawn attentions, sometimes admiration, sometimes resentment. It was the same here, just dressed in tailored suits and subtle remarks. The trick, she knew, was to keep her focus on the board in front of her and not get drawn into side battles that didn't matter. One afternoon, after a particularly tense meeting where she'd countered a flawed budget proposal in front of 3 department heads, Ethan caught up to her in the hallway. "You handled that well," he said. She shrugged. "They're not happy about it. They don't have to be," he replied. "They just have to know you're right." It was a simple statement, but it carried the kind of conviction that anchored her in place. She realized then that the title he'd given her wasn't just for show. He expected her to play the role fully, to stand her ground no matter who sat. Across the table, at the end of the week, she noticed something else. The questions and meetings were starting to come her way before they went to Ethan. People might not have liked it. They were beginning to accept that she was part of his inner circle. And as she walked back to her desk one evening, the city, glowing beyond the glass walls, she knew that acceptance, even reluctant, was a position worth holding. It started with a shift in atmosphere so slight, Ava might have missed it if she hadn't learned to notice the smallest things. People in the hallway stopped making eye contact as she passed. Conversations that used to pause for her now kept going, the words lowered just enough that she couldn't catch them. Even Nora's usual cool professionalism had sharpened into something more guarded. By mid-morning, she found out why. Ethan's assistant came into her workspace with a tight expression and handed her a tablet. "You should see this," she said, her voice clipped. The headline hit her like a sudden drop. "Street Chess Hustler Targets Holt Dynamics CEO." Beneath it was a grainy photo of her at the park, hunched over a chessboard, the caption framing her as a manipulative opportunist. The article claimed she had sought Ethan out with the sole purpose of exploiting his wealth and influence, weaving in distorted details about her past. It painted her as someone who had moved from shelter to shelter, conning people for cash, strategically aligning herself with men who could give her an advantage. There were even quotes anonymous, of course hinting that she had a history of taking more than she gave in whatever arrangement she was in. Ava set the tablet down carefully, though her hands felt tight and hot. She'd been insulted before, underestimated plenty of times, but this was different. This was an attack meant to stick. And the fact that it had found its way into a high-traffic business column meant someone had made sure it would. She didn't have to guess long about why. Over the past few weeks, she'd seen the looks, the tension building as her role with Ethan became more visible. In an environment where status was currency, her sudden arrival and growing influence had upset the balance. Someone wanted her gone. When she stepped into the hallway, she caught the tail end of a conversation, 2 employees whispering near the elevator. "Told you she was trouble," one of them said. They stopped talking the moment they saw her. Ethan called her into his office not long after. He was standing by the window, the skyline spread out behind him, but his focus was on the tablet in his hand. "I assume you've seen it," he said. "I've seen it," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "It's false," he said flatly. "But that doesn't matter to the people reading it. In their minds, there's now a question mark next to your name." She folded her arms, leaning against the edge of his desk. "So someone inside did this. Someone with access," he said. "And with a reason to make you look like a liability." The truth settled between them. The only people who could have fed the press enough detail to spin a believable narrative were high enough in the company to know exactly where to hit. Ava thought about the department heads who'd pushed back hardest against her presence. The ones who saw every new idea she offered as a threat to their position. "Let me guess," she said quietly. "This isn't the kind of thing that just disappears." "No," Ethan agreed. "It's not, but it can be answered." Her jaw tightened. She hated that answering it meant dignifying it. She hated even more that the people in this building, people who'd seen her work firsthand, might choose to believe the headline over the evidence of their own eyes. "I want to know who did it," she said. "You will," Ethan replied, his tone carrying the kind of certainty that wasn't for show. "But right now, I need you to keep doing your job. If this was meant to rattle you, don't let it." She met his gaze, reading the weight in it. He wasn't just telling her to ignore the noise, he was warning her. Whoever had started this wasn't finished. When she left his office, the stairs in the hallway felt heavier. She walked past them without breaking stride, her mind already working. In chess, when an opponent launched an early aggressive attack, it was often meant to provoke a reaction that would open a weakness elsewhere. She wasn't going to give them that, not yet. But she knew one thing for certain. Someone had moved against her, and she was going to find out exactly which piece on the board thought they could take her out. By the time Ethan called her back into his office that afternoon, the air in the building felt different. It kirked her somehow, the way it did before a storm. Ava had spent the last few hours under the weight of sidelong glances and half-finished sentences, and she was already running on the sharp edge between anger and restraint. When she stepped inside, Ethan was standing behind his desk, his suit jacket off, sleeves rolled to his forearms. It wasn't a casual look. It was the look of a man who'd been pacing, thinking too much, not liking where his thoughts had gone. "Close the door," he said. She did, slowly, and leaned against it. "Something you need?" He didn't answer right away, just studied her with that measured gaze of his. When he finally spoke, his tone was clipped. "I've been hearing things, not just from the press inside the company. People are saying there's more truth to that article than you're admitting." Her arms crossed almost on instinct. "And you're telling me this why? To warn me? Or because you believe it?" "I'm telling you because perception matters," he said, stepping around the desk. "If enough people start to think," she cut him off, her voice sharper than she intended. "If enough people start to think I'm exactly what they wrote, you'll have an excuse to get rid of me." His eyes narrowed slightly. "That's not what I said." "No," she shot back. "But it's what you're thinking. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation." He held her gaze, silent, and that silence told her everything she needed to know. He didn't trust her, not completely, not enough to dismiss the accusation without picking it apart first. Something in her chest went cold. "You really think I went out of my way to find you, to work here, just to play you for money? Is that who you think I am?" "I think," he said slowly, "that in my position I have to consider every possibility. That's not about you, it's about protecting this company." She laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "Right, you have to consider every possibility. Even the one where I'm just a con in a hoodie who somehow conned the great Ethan Cross. You're twisting my words." "No," she said, stepping forward now. "I'm hearing them exactly as you mean them. You've been watching me play chess long enough to know I don't make moves without thinking ahead. So believe me when I say I saw this coming the moment I started winning in your world. Someone was going to decide I didn't belong here. What I didn't expect was you standing here, wondering if maybe they're right." His jaw tightened. "You're angry. You're damn right I'm angry," she interrupted. "Because I've done everything you've asked me to. Sat in those meetings, I've helped you close deals. I've given you strategies you didn't have before I walked in, and still, one headline and a few whispers are enough to make you doubt me." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the city through the glass was the only sound in the room. Finally, Ava shook her head, the decision already forming. Before she said it, "I'm done." Ethan's expression barely shifted, but something flickered in his eyes. "You're quitting."
"That's right,"
she said. "You wanted an assistant for a week.
"Yes."
You got more than that. But this is where it ends. I'm not going to sit here and prove myself to you every time someone decides I'm a threat." She turned toward the door, her hand already on the handle when he said her name. She didn't stop Ava. She opened the door without looking back. "Good luck finding someone who plays the game the way I do," she said, and walked out, leaving the heavy silence behind her. The stairs in the hallway followed her all the way to the elevator, but she kept her head high. If this was their win, they could have it. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The doors closed, and she let the floor drop away beneath her, each passing level pulling her further from the man who had seen her potential and just as quickly doubted it. The cold came back quickly that week, settling into the city like it meant to stay. Ava felt it most at night, when the wind cut through her thin hoodie and the concrete under her made every joint ache. She'd been back on the streets for 3 days. Already she could feel the rhythm of it creeping in again, the restless scanning for safe places to sleep. The way you learn to move without looking like you were hurrying, the constant awareness of who was too close and for too long. The thought of seeing the familiar tables, the worn chessboards, the regulars who had once nodded at her as if she belonged there, it made something twist in her chest. She didn't need their pity, and she couldn't stand the thought of their curiosity. All it would take was one person with a phone and the article pulled up on their screen. She'd have to watch their expression shift from recognition to judgment. Not that she could avoid it entirely. The story seemed to follow her. At a coffee shop, where she went to warm up for a few minutes, she noticed two college kids at the next table, a tablet between them. She heard her name before she saw the headline. One of them glanced in her direction, eyes widening, and she left before they could decide whether to say anything. On the bus one afternoon, trying to stay out of the wind, she caught sight of it again, this time on a man's phone. The text. Scrolling as he read aloud to the woman next to him. The words were the same as before, distorted into something that sounded like truth if you didn't know better. She turned her face toward the window, focusing on the gray smear of the city passing by, willing herself not to hear. The worst part wasn't the article itself, was knowing that somewhere in his office, Ethan had read it too. And for a moment, maybe longer, he had wondered if it was true. That was the piece she couldn't shake. The reason her phone stayed in her pocket, even when the urge to call him rose like a wave. Her pride wouldn't let her bridge the distance. If he wanted to find her, he would have to do it without her prompting. Nights were the hardest. She found shelter when she could, but the beds filled quickly, and she wasn't the type to beg her way into one. Instead, she walked until she was too tired to keep going, curling up in corners where the streetlights didn't reach. Her backpack close, one arm looped through the strap, the notebook inside pressed against her side like a heartbeat. Sometimes she took it out and flipped through the pages, games she'd recorded, positions she'd studied. The lines and diagrams steadied her, reminded her there was a world that made sense, even if it existed only in 64 squares. But more often she closed it again without adding anything new. She didn't feel like playing. Days bled together, marked only by the weather and the faces she passed. Every so often she thought she caught sight of someone from the Campania flash of a suit. The profile of a face she'd seen in a meeting, but it was always gone before she could be sure. She told herself it didn't matter. That world had closed its doors. Still, when she lay awake at night, she found herself replaying moments she didn't want to admit she missed. The quiet between moves in the conference room, it's the way Ethan had sometimes looked at her when she'd spotted something no one else had. The brief satisfaction of a plan unfolding exactly as she'd imagined it. She told herself it wasn't about him. It was about the work, the challenge, the fact that for the first time in years she'd been part of something that felt like more than just survival. And now it was gone. So she kept walking, kept her head down, kept her distance from the park and the people in it. Pride was the only thing she had left that felt entirely her own. And she wasn't about to let it go, not even if it meant staying alone. Ethan had replayed their last conversation in his mind far too many times. The sharpness in her voice, the finality in the way she walked away. At first he'd told himself he was angry that she had quit, without letting him explain that she had shut him out completely. But beneath that, irritation had been replaced by a quieter, more uncomfortable feeling, the suspicion that he had failed her. The article hadn't sat right with him from the beginning. There had been too many specifics. Too many details twisted just enough to seem believable, but not enough to hold up under scrutiny. He'd let his uncertainty get the better of him, and now that she was gone, he couldn't shake the thought that he might have been played, so he started digging. It began with a call to a friend in the legal department, one who owed him a favor. He asked for help tracing the source of the leak. It wasn't easy. The article had been routed through multiple tips, anonymous emails, and off-the-record whispers. But eventually, the trail narrowed to a single point of forwarded packet of background information sent to the reporter under an alias. From there, it was a matter of cross-referencing IP addresses and timestamps. The origin wasn't some random outsider. It came from a corporate device. The name attached to it didn't surprise him. Randall Keats, senior vice president, one of the longest tenured executives in the company, a man who had made no secret of his disdain for Ava's presence in the office, who had openly questioned her qualifications in front of others. Ethan felt the slow, tight burn of anger settle in his chest as the pieces fit together. This hadn't been about protecting the company. It had been about cutting her down before she could become someone Keats couldn't ignore. But knowing who had done it wasn't enough. Ethan wanted proof not just of the sabotage, but of Ava herself. If he was going to fix this, he needed something undeniable, something that showed the truth of who she was and what she had survived. He didn't want vague explanations. He wanted the kind of evidence that would silence anyone who doubted her. He hired a private investigator, a man who had handled due diligence for high-profile clients before. The investigator returned after a week with a thick file. Ethan spread the contents across his desk late one night, his office quiet except for the faint hum of the city outside the window. There were photocopies of records from a group home in Newark, her name, listed on intake forms at age 14. Following the death of her father, a death certificate was there too, along with tournament listings that bore his name, Daniel Reyes, a mid-tier competitive chess player who had, according to old news clippings, been known for his aggressive middle-game strategies. There were faded photographs of father and daughter at folding tables in community centers, Ava barely tall enough to see over the board. The file detailed the years that followed short stays in foster homes, periods of running away, stretches. In shelters, there were gaps where nothing was recorded, times when she'd clearly slipped through the cracks of the system. The investigator had managed to fill some of them with accounts from people who remembered her, a shelter volunteer, who recalled a quiet girl with a battered chess set, a librarian who had once waived her late fees because she was borrowing. Nothing but chess manuals. As Ethan read, the weight of it all pressed in on him. This was not the story the article had told. This was a record of resilience, of survival in a world that had given her little and taken much. It reinforced what he had already seen in her eyes across the chessboard, an ability to read the game, whether it was carved in wood and squares or played out in life itself. By the time he reached the end of the file, Ethan knew two things with absolute clarity. First, Randall Keats had orchestrated the smear campaign, and Ethan intended to make sure he paid for it. Second, Ava deserved to know that someone had finally gone to the trouble of seeing her whole story, not the version, twisted for headlines, but the truth. He closed the file slowly, pressing his palms against the cover as if to keep its contents safe. He had the proof. Now he just had to find her. And he knew that wasn't going to be as simple as walking back to the park. The rain had been steady. For hours, turning the sidewalks into dark mirrors that caught the glow of passing headlights. Most of the park was empty, the usual clusters of chess players long gone, their boards packed away before the first drops fell. But under the dim halo of a single street lamp, a folding table still stood, its surface slick with water. Ava sat across from an older man in a heavy coat, her hood pulled up, a thin strand of hair plastered to her cheek. The board between them was speckled with rain, pieces darkened from the damp. She didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were fixed on the pattern of moves, her fingers light as they nudged a pawn forward. Ethan had been searching for hours, retracing the places she might go. The park had been his last guess, and for a moment, as he saw her there, he just stood at the edge of the path, watching. She looked smaller than he remembered, not because of her size, but because of the quiet weight in her shoulders. He almost turned back, unsure if she'd even let him speak. But the thought of walking away again left a sour taste in his mouth. He stepped forward, his shoes splashing in shallow puddles, and stopped a few feet from the table. The older man glanced up, recognized him, and excused himself, mumbling something about the rain as he hurried off. Ava didn't look up. She reached for a bishop, set it down carefully, and finally leaned back. Her voice was flat when she spoke. "If you're here to play, I'm not in the mood." Ethan didn't sit. "I'm not here for a game," he said quietly. "I'm here because I owe you an apology." Expression stayed guarded. The rain tapped a steady rhythm on the table, the drops pooling around the scattered pieces. "Took you long enough," she said, not with anger, but with the dull resignation of someone who had learned not to expect much. He told her about the investigation, about Randall Keats, about the file that documented her life in ways the article never had. He didn't try to justify his hesitation before, didn't dress it up in excuses. "I should have believed you," he said simply. "I didn't, and that's on me." Ava's gaze shifted to the board. She moved a knight absent-mindedly. More to keep her hands busy than to think about the position. "So what now? You've got your proof. You can tell everyone you were right all along." Ethan shook his head. "No, this isn't about me being right. This is about making sure people see you for who you are, not what someone decided to write about you. And I want to start with something real." He told her about the program, how he'd set up a mentorship initiative at his company, designed to give opportunities to young people who'd been overlooked, who hadn't had the resources to follow the usual path. He said it would carry her name, not as a gesture of pity, but because her story was the reason it existed at all. Ava blinked at him, the rain catching in her lashes. "You're serious? Dead serious?" he said. "And I don't just want your name on it. I want you to have a public role in the company. Advisor, spokesperson, whatever you're comfortable with. You'd be shaping it from the inside." A long moment she didn't answer. The rain had begun to ease, softening to a mist, the lamplight diffusing into the damp air. She picked up the black king from the board, turned it slowly in her fingers. "You think putting me in your office again is going to fix what happened?" "I think giving you the platform you deserve is the least I can do," Ethan said. "The rest is up to you." She studied him, searching for the catch, the hidden condition. But there wasn't one. He stood there in the rain, his coat darkened and heavy, waiting without pushing. Finally, she set the king back on the board. "1 week," she said, echoing the words she'd used the first time he'd made her an offer. "If I don't like it, I walk." Ethan nodded, relief flickering across his face. "Fair enough." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle patter of water on pavement. Somewhere beyond the park, a car horn blared, then faded into the distance. Ava began gathering the pieces, slipping them into a worn cloth bag. For the first time that night, she let a small, almost imperceptible smile cross her lips. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The hall was filled with the low hum of conversation, the kind that settles over a room when everyone knows they're about to witness something significant. Rows of chairs faced a stage framed by banners in deep blue and white, each printed with the name of the new foundation. The scent of polished wood and fresh paint lingered in the air, the building still carrying the crispness of something newly made. Along the walls, photographs showed children bent over chessboards, some in uniforms, others in street clothes, all with the same look of sharp focus Ava once wore on a park bench in the rain. Ava stood just off stage, adjusting the lapel of her tailored jacket. The years had softened certain things about her features a little more defined, her posture more assured, but the intensity in her eyes had only grown sharper. On her right hand, a thin silver ring caught the light as she gripped a small stack of note cards. She wouldn't be reading from them, but she liked having them there, a kind of anchor. From her position, she could see the front row of the audience. There were journalists, sponsors, a handful of grandmasters she'd once studied from a distance, and beyond them, a scattering of young players in neatly pressed shirts, each invited as part of the Foundation's first cohort. Nestled among the crowd, she spotted him, Ethan. His hair had gone grayer, but his eyes were the same sharp, curious, with that slight upward curl at the corner when something amused him. He sat with his hands folded loosely in his lap, watching her with a look that was equal parts pride and a quiet understanding only the two of them shared. The announcer's voice carried through the hall, introducing her not just as the founder of the Youth Chess Foundation, but as one of the youngest grandmasters in the country. The applause swelled, and Ava stepped onto the stage, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. She took her place at the podium, waiting for the room to settle. She began by talking about the purpose of the foundation to provide resources, mentorship, and opportunities to children who might otherwise never see a tournament board. She spoke of chess as more than a game, describing it as a language of patience, foresight, and resilience. Her voice carried easily, steady, and unhurried, the years of public speaking having smoothed away the hesitation she once felt. Then she set the note cards down and shifted slightly, the edge in her tones softening. "I'm often asked how I got here," she said. "People want to hear about the big wins, the titles, the trophies. But what they don't always realize is that none of those things started with victory. Started with survival. And survival isn't something you do alone." Her gaze drifted toward the middle of the audience, finding Ethan without difficulty. "When I was living on the streets, I didn't have much, just a chess set, a notebook, and the memory of a father who taught me the game. One afternoon, a businessman challenged me to a match in the park. He expected to win. He didn't." The crowd chuckled softly, but she didn't pause long enough for it to swell. "That game changed everything. Not because I beat him, but because he came back. He asked questions. He listened. And in time, he gave me something far more valuable than money. He gave me a chance to play on a bigger board." She let the words sink in before continuing. "So today, as we open these doors to young players who might be sitting in the same place I once was, I want to thank that businessman, because he learned the game of life from a homeless girl. And in doing so, he taught me that trust can be rebuilt, that people can surprise you, and that sometimes your greatest move is helping someone else make theirs." The room erupted in applause, some rising to their feet. Ethan remained seated, though his hands came together in a slow, deliberate clap, his smile small but deeply genuine. For him, this moment wasn't about recognition. It was about seeing the person she had become, knowing he had played a part in it, and accepting that she had taken the game far beyond anything he could have imagined. As the event continued, Ava moved through the crowd, greeting guests, shaking hands with sponsors, and kneeling to speak eye-to-eye with the children who would be the Foundation's first members. Ethan stayed back, content to watch. At one point, she glanced over her shoulder and caught his eye. No words passed between them, but the exchange was clear enough. In a game that had once been about kings and pawns, they had both found a kind of checkmate. Neither had expected one that had nothing to do with the board, and everything to do with the life they had built from that first rainy afternoon.